Sophie gazed at her reflection in the hospital window, her heart racing with excitement and nervousness. She had just given birth to twins, a moment she had dreamt about for months. A high school teacher living in Mexico, Sophie had always wanted children with her husband, Douglas. They had imagined a beautiful family, talked about names, planned their future, and decorated the nursery with the softest pastels. But nothing had prepared her for what was about to happen. But before we get deeper into the story, I want to hear from you. Where are you watching from today? Leave a comment below. The labor had been long but uncomplicated, and when the doctor finally placed the twins in her arms, Sophie's heart swelled with an overwhelming love that took her breath away. She looked down at her newborn babies, and for a moment, the world stopped. But something was different. Michelle, the first baby to arrive, had Sophie's fair skin and Douglas's blue eyes. She was delicate and soft, exactly what Sophie had imagined their child would look like. But Ralph, born just minutes later, had dark skin and deep brown eyes. Sophie's breath caught in her throat. She stared at her newborn son, unable to process what she was seeing. The twins, Michelle and Ralph, looked nothing alike. "Douglas," Sophie whispered, her voice shaking as she looked over at her husband. He had been pacing nervously by the door, waiting for this moment. When he saw the twins, his face paled. For a long, suffocating second, neither of them spoke. The silence between them was thick with disbelief, confusion, and an unspoken question that hung in the air like a blade. Sophie could see the storm gathering in Douglas's eyes as he stared at Ralph, his jaw clenched, his hands balled into fists at his sides. Douglas? Sophie's voice trembled as she tried to reach out to him, but he took a step back, shaking his head. No, this can't be right," he muttered, his voice low and dangerous. "What is this, Sophie? What did you do?" Sophie felt as though the ground beneath her had collapsed. "What do you mean? These are our babies, Ralph and Michelle. Look at them, Douglas. They're ours," she pleaded, her heart breaking as she held her children tighter. But Douglas's face twisted with anger and betrayal. He stormed across the room, his voice rising with fury. "Don't lie to me, Sophie! I can see it! That boy is not mine!" Sophie recoiled as though she had been slapped. She felt the tears sting her eyes, but she couldn't let them fall. Not now. "Douglas, please," she begged, her voice barely above a whisper. "I don't know how this happened, but I swear to you, Ralph is your son. Both of them are. There's no one else. You have to believe me." But Douglas wasn't listening. His face was red with rage, his eyes wild with a mixture of disbelief and bitterness. He pointed to Ralph, his voice venomous. "How could that boy be mine? Look at him, Sophie. He doesn't look like me. He doesn't even look like you. You've been lying to me. You've been with someone else. Admit it." Sophie's heart shattered. She looked down at her son, her beautiful, innocent son, who had done nothing but come into the world, and now he was being rejected by his own father. She felt the tears spill down her cheeks as she shook her head. "Douglas, I swear on everything I love, I've never been unfaithful to you. There must be some explanation. Please, let's talk to the doctors." But Douglas wasn't listening. He grabbed his coat, his movements sharp and filled with anger. "No, I don't want to hear it. I can't believe anything you say anymore," he spat, his eyes cold as ice. "You've ruined everything." Sophie watched in horror as Douglas turned on his heel and stormed out of the hospital room, leaving her alone with their newborn twins. The door slammed shut behind him, and the sound echoed through her heart like a final cruel blow. The days after Douglas's departure were a blur of heartache and confusion. Sophie had never felt so alone in her life. The joy she had felt at becoming a mother had been overshadowed by the devastation of losing her husband in a single, unforgivable moment. He had refused to see her or the babies since that night, and despite her attempts to call him, he wouldn't answer. The doctors had tried to explain the rare genetic occurrence that could cause twins to be born with different skin tones. Sophie and Douglas both carried recessive genes, which had manifested in Ralph's darker complexion. It was a 1 in a million chance, but it had happened. But Douglas refused to hear it. In his mind, Sophie had betrayed him, and no amount of medical explanation could change that. Sophie spent long nights in the nursery, rocking Ralph and Michelle in her arms, wondering how she would raise them on her own. She loved them more than she thought possible, but the pain of Douglas's absence was a constant ache in her chest. She had lost the man she loved, and her children had lost their father, all because of something neither of them could control. Months passed, and despite her best efforts, Sophie couldn't reach Douglas. He had moved out of their home, refusing any contact with her. The once vibrant and happy marriage they shared had disintegrated into cold, bitter silence. Sophie's friends and family rallied around her, but it wasn't the same. One rainy afternoon, Sophie was sitting in the rocking chair, holding Ralph close as Michelle slept beside him. She looked down at her son, his dark brown eyes gazing up at her with pure innocence. In him, she saw love, hope, and strength. She had always wanted to give her children the world, but now she could only offer them herself. Her heart ached for what Ralph would face. She knew the world could be cruel, that people wouldn't always understand or accept him. But she promised herself that she would love him fiercely, protect him, and never let him feel the sting of his father's rejection. As Sophie kissed the top of Ralph's head, the phone rang. She hesitated before picking it up, her heart leaping into her throat when she saw Douglas's name on the screen. After months of silence, he was finally calling. "Douglas?" she answered, her voice tentative, filled with a mixture of hope and dread. There was a long pause on the other end, and for a moment, Sophie thought he might hang up. But then Douglas's voice came through, cold and distant. "Sophie, I've spoken to my lawyer. I want a divorce." The words hit Sophie like a physical blow. She had been holding on to the faint hope that, given time, Douglas might come to his senses, that he would accept Ralph and Michelle, that they could be a family again. But his words shattered that hope completely. I don't understand," Sophie whispered, her voice breaking. "Douglas, I told you there's nothing wrong. Ralph is your son." But Douglas's voice was firm, unyielding. "I don't care, Sophie. I can't do this. I can't look at him and not see your betrayal. I won't raise a child that isn't mine." Sophie's hand trembled as she held the phone, her vision blurred by tears. "Please, Douglas, don't do this. Don't leave us. Don't leave your children." But the line went dead, and Sophie was left holding the phone, her world crumbling around her. In the years that followed, Sophie learned how to live without Douglas. She raised Ralph and Michelle on her own, and though it was difficult, she poured every ounce of her love and strength into her children. Ralph grew up to be a bright, kind-hearted boy, and though he often asked about his father, Sophie always told him the truth gently. She made sure he knew that he was loved, no matter what. Michelle, too, was a beacon of light in Sophie's life. The twins, though different in appearance, shared a bond that was unbreakable. They looked out for each other, and their love for their mother was as fierce as the love she had for them. Sophie never remarried, and though her heart still carried the scars of Douglas's betrayal, she found peace in knowing that she had done everything she could for her children. She had been their rock when everything else had fallen apart. And as the years passed, she realized that she didn't need anyone else's approval or understanding. She had her children, and that was enough. The divorce papers arrived a week after Douglas's phone call, with his signature already neatly scrawled across the lines. Sophie stared at the documents for what felt like hours, her eyes tracing the cold, impersonal language of separation and finality. The man she once loved, the father of her children, was cutting ties with them forever. She couldn't understand how a man who had once been so kind, so warm, could walk away from his own family. How could he turn his back on Ralph, a boy who had done nothing but come into the world through an unexpected twist of fate? Sophie's heart ached not just for herself, but for her son, who would never know his father's love. With trembling hands, she signed the papers. There was no point in fighting it. Douglas had made his choice, and nothing she said or did would change his mind. She placed the papers back in the envelope and mailed them off, sealing the chapter of her life that had once held so much promise. Months turned into years, and Sophie found strength in the love she had for her twins. Raising them alone in Mexico wasn't easy. There were moments of exhaustion, moments where she felt overwhelmed by the weight of it all, but she pressed on. She had to, for Ralph and Michelle. Ralph grew into a sensitive, thoughtful child. His dark skin and curly hair made him stand out in a predominantly white community, but Sophie made sure he never felt different in her eyes. She taught him that his uniqueness was something to be proud of, that he was special because of who he was, not in spite of it. But the questions came, as she knew they would. Ralph was only 5 when he first asked about his father. "Mommy," he said one day, his big brown eyes looking up at her, "why don't I look like Michelle? And where's Daddy?" Sophie's heart clenched, but she had promised herself she would always be honest with her children, no matter how hard the truth was. "You and Michelle are twins, sweetheart, but sometimes twins don't look exactly alike. You're both special in your own way," she said, brushing a curl away from his forehead. "And as for Daddy, he made a choice to leave, but that doesn't mean he didn't love you." Ralph's face scrunched up in confusion. "He doesn't want to see us." Sophie felt the sting of tears but blinked them back. "It's not about you, Ralph. It's something grown-ups don't always understand themselves. But you have me and I love you more than anything in the whole wide world." Ralph seemed to accept this, nodding slowly, though Sophie could see the lingering sadness in his eyes. She wished she could shield him from the pain, but she knew that part of growing up meant understanding that not everyone stays, even when they should. As Ralph and Michelle got older, the differences between them became more noticeable, not just physically, but in how the world treated them. Sophie had prepared herself for this, but nothing could fully protect Ralph from the casual cruelty of ignorance. By the time they were 10, Michelle was already a popular, outgoing girl with her mother's light blonde hair and Douglas's piercing blue eyes. Ralph, on the other hand, was more reserved, thoughtful, and unfortunately often the target of whispers and sideways glances. At school, Ralph faced questions that Michelle never had to answer. "Are you adopted? How can you be twins when you're so different? Why don't you look like your mom?" Sophie's heart broke every time Ralph came home with a new story of the hurtful things kids said to him. She would hold him close, tell him that those words didn't define him, and that his worth wasn't measured by the color of his skin. But as Ralph grew, the weight of his father's absence became heavier. One night, after a particularly hard day at school, Ralph came to Sophie with tears in his eyes. "Mom," he whispered, sitting on the edge of her bed, "why didn't Dad want me?" The question hit her like a sledgehammer. She had known this day would come, but it didn't make it any easier to face. Sophie took a deep breath, pulling Ralph into her arms. "Ralph, your father's decision had nothing to do with you. He was scared, and he didn't understand the beauty of what we had. It wasn't your fault. It was never your fault." Ralph buried his face in her shoulder, his small body shaking with sobs. "But if he loved me, he would have stayed." Sophie squeezed him tighter, her own tears falling silently. "I know it feels that way, but love doesn't always look the way it should. Sometimes people make mistakes, and sometimes they let fear control them. But your dad's choices don't define who you are. You are an amazing, smart, kind boy, and I'm so proud of you. Always." Ralph sniffled, pulling away to look at his mother. "Do you think he'll ever come back?" Sophie's heart shattered at the hope in his voice. She had stopped holding on to that hope long ago, but she couldn't take it away from her son. "I don't know, sweetheart. But what I do know is that you have all the love you need right here. You, me, and Michelle. We're a family. That's what matters." Ralph nodded, though the sadness lingered in his eyes. Sophie knew that no matter how much love she gave him, there would always be a part of Ralph that longed for his father's acceptance. It was a wound that might never fully heal. Years passed, and Ralph and Michelle grew into remarkable young adults. Ralph excelled in school, particularly in science and math, while Michelle had a talent for the arts. They were as close as ever, despite their differences, and Sophie couldn't have been prouder of the people they were becoming. But Ralph still carried the burden of his father's rejection, a weight he couldn't shake no matter how hard he tried. When he turned 18, he made a decision that Sophie had always feared. He wanted to find Douglas. "I need to know, Mom," Ralph said one evening, sitting across from Sophie at the kitchen table. "I need to hear it from him. Why he left? Why he couldn't stay? Sophie's chest tightened, but she knew this was a journey Ralph had to take for himself. She couldn't protect him from the truth, no matter how painful it might be. "I understand," she said softly, reaching across the table to take his hand. "Just promise me one thing. Don't let whatever he says change how you see yourself. You are enough, Ralph. You've always been enough." Ralph squeezed her hand, his eyes filled with determination. "I just need to know, Mom." It took months of searching, but Ralph finally tracked Douglas down in a small town just outside of Chicago. The man who had abandoned him was living a quiet life, far removed from the family he had left behind. Ralph stood outside the modest house, his heart pounding in his chest, unsure of what to expect. When Douglas opened the door and saw Ralph standing there, a young man with dark skin, tall and strong, his face paled, just as it had on the day Ralph was born. For a long moment, neither of them spoke. "Dad," Ralph said quietly, the word feeling foreign on his tongue. Douglas's expression hardened. "What are you doing here?" Ralph's heart sank, but he pressed on. I wanted to know why you left, why you couldn't stay." Douglas's eyes darted away, shame flickering across his face. I couldn't deal with it. I couldn't look at you and not think." "Think what?" Ralph demanded, his voice cracking with emotion. "That I wasn't yours? That I didn't deserve a father because of how I looked?" Douglas's silence was answer enough. Ralph felt a surge of anger and sadness wash over him. "You abandoned me. You abandoned us. And for what? Because you couldn't handle the fact that I was different?" Douglas looked down at his feet, unable to meet his son's gaze. "I wasn't ready for that kind of life. I'm sorry, Ralph." The apology was hollow, empty. Ralph realized in that moment that he had spent his whole life waiting for something that would never come, his father's acceptance. But as he stood there, he also realized something else. He didn't need it. "You know what?" Ralph said, his voice steady now. "I don't need your apology. I have a family. My mom, Michelle, they've given me all the love I need. I just wanted you to know that you didn't break me. I'm stronger than you ever were." With that, Ralph turned and walked away, leaving Douglas standing in the doorway, a ghost of the past that no longer had power over him. Back in Mexico, Sophie welcomed Ralph home with open arms. She could see the change in him, the weight that had lifted now that he had confronted the man who had caused him so much pain. "How do you feel?" she asked, her voice soft as they sat together on the porch, watching the sun set over the horizon. Ralph smiled, a genuine smile that Sophie hadn't seen in years. "Free," he said simply. And for the first time in a long time, Sophie felt that maybe, just maybe, they could finally move forward together.